Good afternoon. My name is Ewelina Prażmo, and together with my colleague Rafał Augustyn, I would like to present this talk, which is related to one of the more recent phenomena that we have observed in Polish language, namely the semantic extension of the suffix oza in Polish. The title of the talk is, as you can see, Going Beyond the Medical Domain, a cognitive perspective on the semantic extensions of the suffix oza in contemporary Polish.
Yes, I'm going with the slide. Okay.
So the brief outline of our talks is as follows. So first of all, we would like to introduce the concept of medicalization as it applies to various kinds of discourses. Then we'd like to present the polysemy of the suffix oza in Polish and a note on the etymology of the suffix. Then we'll talk you through the methodology of our study and then provide semantic extensions as related to radial categories that we have established for this particular suffix. Now we propose some new semantic clusters for oza and then illustrate those new clusters with the analysis of selected examples, after which we arrive at conclusions. So the concept of medicalization of discourse has been analyzed, well, to some extent, especially in the context of socio-political discourses. So basically by medicalization, we mean some kind of a growing tendency towards the use of terms traditionally referring to the sphere of medicine as applied to non-medical sphere, non-medical domain. So this metaphorical framing, for example, of social and political events in terms of diseases and other health and medicine related issues is what we mean by medicalization of discourse. So what can be observed is an increase in the use of quasi-medical terms, for example, lexical items with affixes conventionally related to medical use that resemble medical terms. This is exactly the case with the suffix oza. So at the morphological level, in non-specialized context, and that is very often achieved for expressive purposes. Here are a number of examples coming especially from those socio-political discourses, here specifically in relation to the context of the discussion about Brexit. So Brexit oftentimes is represented as a disease and described linguistically with the use of terminology related to the medical domain. So just those examples in bold. Brexit is a disease-ridden flea infecting various countries, well, various groups of people, various groups of or sectors of economy, and so on. It's like a flu or a plague. And then political groups can suffer from the Brexit fever, and then they risk paralysis. Another expression here in bold, hot and cold sweats of Brexit. Then it is metaphorically framed as a disease that hijacks the body. And then even more graphical representations of what happens to countries, what symptoms they can suffer from when they go through different political scenarios, such as, for example, that of Brexit. Okay. Then medicalization in the context of finance-related discourses, so various kinds of financial crises and economic crises can be represented by means of metaphorically framing that as a medical problem. So then financial contagion that affects banks, and then we talk about small illnesses that may become epidemic. But luckily, countries can inoculate themselves against those kinds of problems. And then finally here, we present this polysemous model of the suffix and a note on the etymology. So the suffix oza, as used in Polish, dates back to its uses in Greek when osis actually means a state, abnormal condition or action. Then those meanings also function in English. So osis as related to functional diseases or condition, or again, abnormalities, abnormal conditions, state, processes, and so on, abnormal formations, or basically formation of something or increase in something. And then in Polish, this suffix is mostly related to pathological medical conditions, that is diseases, but also possibly it may be related to its Latin roots, where the suffix osus actually means full of, which conflates into the English suffix os here. And in Polish, we have elements like fructosa and saccharosa, glucosa, lactosa, fructose, saccharose, glucose, which are related to to another domain, but possibly there is this kind of confusion or merger of those meanings in the use of this suffix in Polish. Well, the main aims and the methodology that we use in our study is basically related to trying to get to the cognitive motivation behind those novel uses of terms related to this particular suffix that we examine. And then it's an attempt to provide a categorization of those novel meanings, novel uses. In order to do so, we may refer to those semantic extensions in terms of conceptual metaphor and conceptual blending theories. And then our study is based on a self-compiled corpus of contemporary examples extracted from Google search engine and manually evaluated in the context. So those novel meanings, from what we have observed, cluster together, but still they are all related to the prototypical meaning of the suffix, and that brings to mind the notion of radial categories. Here, just one quote that shows basically what those radial categories are about. So in a radial category, all subcategories are somehow motivated by the meaning of the prototype. But whereas the prototype tends to belong to the physical domain, those categories do not necessarily relate directly to the physical domain, but they are related in one way or another through those interlocking basically overlapping similarities to the prototype, but they are not necessarily discrete. I mean, as I said, they can be overlapping, and for that reason, it's really difficult to come up with like one single prototype to those complex categories. There is the prototype, and then different nodes, different elements being related to that. All in all, there is like a web of interrelated meanings. And this is what we are trying to propose in this particular talk, to show those interrelations between different meanings as they cluster around the prototype.
And now in the following, we would like to move on to the discussion of the main results of our analysis. And we would like to do it, synthetically and briefly. Based on the analysis of the examples encountered on different discussion fora and generally on the internet, we have identified 4 main new clusters, semantic clusters connected with the novel uses of the suffix suffix oza in Polish. Since those clusters exhibit this radial category properties, the meanings that we identified and also give here very often overlap to some extent, or they actually transform, or there is this transient progression from the one meaning into another. So for instance, when we consider the first group, which we can actually then divide into two separate subclusters, we deal with expressions of a negative attitude of the speaker to a certain aspect of the surrounding reality. In the first subcluster, the focus is put on the aspects of the physical space, and hence we've got the examples as you can see here. They all relate to something that we could consider a pathological development in the surrounding environment. Like for instance, the fact that there are too many billboards, or there are too many walls, or maybe graffitis and the signs in the physical space around us. The second subcluster, 1b, groups the expressions that focus on some aspects of the social space. So here we deal with a more metaphorical projections, like for instance, the expressions szkolenioza, projektoza, or even grantoza, which we could translate into English as project oasis or grant oasis, focusing on the fact that there are many, or there are possibly too many projects, or there is a pressure actually to participate in projects, trainings, or grants. And actually all those examples in this group focus on this component, this semantic component. Then in the second group, we've got expressions, or actually the phrases, or the uses of the words with the suffix oza, which express the annoyance of the speaker at the development of some social significance, usually the latest developments. So for instance, in this group, we will find expressions such as Twitteroza, which would be Twitterosis, or for instance, virusoza, maseczkoza, pandemioza, all these referring to the recent pandemic. So face mask osis, pandemicosis, probably if we were supposed to translate those in this word into English. Then we may have two further groups here. So the third group gathers expressions that could be designated as emphatic markers of the emotional state of the speaker. And again, we can divide this group into two subclusters, because the first one is mostly negative. Very often speakers use those expressions to show they disbelieve, like the two examples given here. And later on, you will see actually the examples in the context of use. And then the second subgroup, which, in contrast to the first subgroup, so 3a, is mostly positive, or sometimes it seems positive, but actually it's ironic. So it like conflates the two semantic potentials. And then there is yet another, the fourth group, which are emphatic expressions of a strong negative attitude towards a particular phenomenon. And what is interesting here is that sometimes those are expressions that could designate the whole group of people. So it functions like a metonymic reference to a group of people. And I think good examples of that would be, for instance, tramposa, so Trumposes, which can relate to, which can refer actually to the phenomenon connected with the particular way of thinking, characteristic of Trump and his political basis, but also as a reference to the whole group of people having similar ideas. And as I said, we wanted also to show you, to demonstrate a couple of examples in the context of use. But I think that you can also browse through them at your own pace, also later on. So we have provided a couple of examples for each cluster. What is maybe interesting and worth adding here is the fact that the examples that we found refer not only to the colloquial use of language, but actually many of those examples, especially in some clusters, like in cluster 1 and also cluster 4, to some degree also cluster number 2, they are very often found in journalistic texts, also in texts of high quality. So it seems that this phenomenon is actually quite prevalent across different registers in the Polish language. So the example of the first cluster would be, for instance, reklamosa, which we could translate as advertoses, or for instance, billboardosa, billboardoses, and I think the best representation of that would be probably actually the pictorial representation. So this is what is being criticized a lot in Poland, especially in some cities, that there is this prevalence of all those billboards in the physical space of those cities, which is of course not particularly aesthetic, or at least it disturbs the aesthetics of those cities, of those public spaces. The example of cluster 1b could be, for instance, treścioza, which could be translated as content oses, which is also a very interesting example, because it actually appeared in the space of literary criticism, where it is juxtaposed with focusing on the form, or the focus put on the content. The example from cluster number 2 would be, for instance, maseczkoza, as I mentioned before, connected with the still ongoing epidemic, actually. So there are lots of such examples that can be found on the internet. Cluster 3a, which is quite a small cluster. Those are those expressions of those are emphatic uses of the expressions featuring this suffix oza, as for instance pixelosa, pixelosis. So the annoyance at the fact that something is pixelated. And a bit larger group in cluster 3b, emphatic uses, ironic or positive, and these are more typical for the colloquial language use. So they can be found very often, usually in some comments or in comment sections on different fora. And for instance, in cluster 4, we will have the examples such as cretinosa, moranosis, or the one that I've mentioned, tramposa, tramposis. And in fact, actually, in Polish, we've got a number of the creations similar to tramposa, but referring to Polish politics, the world of Polish politics. So with the names of some parties or some prominent political figures to which this suffix oza is added. And finally, so this is a possible representation of the relationships between those different meanings, or those novel uses of the prefix oza. So starting with the prototypical understanding of the prototypical meaning, a sense of the suffix oza, first we extend it to those more physical meanings, as in cluster 1, and then probably cluster 1 gave rise to the further extension to the cluster 2, whereas the clusters 3 and 4 probably appeared or emerged as an extension of cluster 2 by way of metaphorical extensions or extensions via conceptual blending. And those are the references on which our presentation is based and our analysis is based, the most important ones. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, you can actually ask those either in the discussion time here during the conference, but of course you can also address any questions to us via email, and we will be glad to answer any of those. Thank you for your attention once again, and see you again, hopefully, in better times and live.
Thank you.